Futures in Fundraising is presented by Alexander Haas. Alexander Haas, transforming institutions that transform lives.
Welcome to a special edition of Futures in Fundraising. I'm David King, president of Alexander Haas, your host. We're going to do something a little bit different today. As you're probably aware, the Giving USA 2018 was released recently, today in fact. We're going to take a look at the numbers in Giving USA and give you an overview of what the results were. We're also going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the areas of the report that are a little more interesting or a little different trend-wise. So to not bury the lead, you may have already heard, but giving last year topped $410 billion. That is the largest year ever for giving in the United States. It's a landmark year and the fifth year in a row of really solid continued growth in giving. You can see on the chart here that we are in a period of fairly steep growth, which is really good. The economy is growing and giving is keeping pace, which is good news for all of us in the fundraising business. You may be wondering, how can I predict what's going to happen in fundraising in any given year? And it's a really difficult challenge, and there is no perfect indicator. But what we found at Giving USA and looking at the data going back to the 1950s is that the Dow Jones Industrial Average particularly, or really the Standard & Poor's more so as it's a bit broader, but the stock markets generally are a great indicator of what's going to happen in fundraising down the road. So it's a leading indicator. If you look at the chart on the screen, you'll see that the Dow is the dotted white line, or the S&P, is the dotted white line. And you can see that when that line goes up and down, about a 12-month lag, and then giving follows it. So if you want to know what's going to happen 12 to 18 months out, the thing to do is be looking at what is happening with the Dow. You can see here at the end of this, at the 2017 end, we've got a really steep increase in the S&P, and you can see that all of that time that the S&P is increasing, giving is also going up with it. So that is our best indicator of what's going to happen with giving, trying to look forward into the future, since we are on Futures in Fundraising, is what's going on in the stock markets. That has a big impact. In terms of the sources of contributions this year, the chart didn't change much. You see there 70% of the money came from individuals. That compares to 72% last year. 16% from foundations, which compares to 15% last year. 9% from bequest compared to 8% last year, and 5% from corporations, which is the same. So we had a little bit of a shift there. 2% less from individual donors, divided 1% more from foundations, 1% more from bequest giving, which is actually individual giving. I think it's important to note here that about half of foundation giving is from family foundations, which really is more like individual giving than institutional foundation giving. So we often consider part of that foundation giving to be individual giving, but just the money's coming out of a different checking account, out of a foundation checking account rather than a personal checking account. But once again, you combine bequest giving, which is deceased individuals, and individual giving from living individuals, and you're right at 79% of total giving coming from individuals. Still the lion's share of giving, even though we did see a little movement this year to bequest and foundation giving. When you look at giving for individuals, you can see we're at $286 billion. Again, that's an all-time high. Last year was $281 billion, so up $4.5 billion in a single year. But one thing to keep in mind about that, last year there were $4.1 billion in mega gifts, so gifts over $300 million. So we have about $4.5 billion in growth, but $4.1 billion came from the very top of the donor pyramid. So almost all of the growth came from those mega gifts. To put that into some perspective, in 2016, those mega gifts only totaled $1.5 billion. So over $3 billion more in mega gift giving last year really helped move the needle on this. Not that people didn't give more broadly and more, obviously they did, but a lot of that growth came from the donors at the very top of the giving pyramid making mega gifts, and we'll talk about a couple of those when we get to foundation giving. In terms of foundation giving, up to $66.9 million. billion. You'll see on the chart that its foundation giving has been in a period of very steady increased growth going back to about 2009, 2010. Probably the steepest trajectory of growth that we've ever seen in foundation giving, at least in the last 15 years. For 2016, giving was $59.2 billion. For 2017, giving was $59.2 billion. So a $7.7 billion increase from foundations this last year. That's 71% more coming out of foundations than what the increase was for individuals. So we really did see that 1% growth that we saw from foundations and market share really is tagged to a lot of individual giving from foundations going up steadily. So 7.7 billion increase there. Again, foundation giving, because the assets are invested and because foundations are required to give away 5% of their assets every year, are heavily correlated to the stock markets. So again, when you see the stock markets performing very well, you're almost naturally going to see foundation giving perform very well. And that's some of where we see this increase, because we have been on a very nice 7-year growth in the equities markets, and that has a direct impact on what foundations are required to contribute year over year. Looking at bequest giving, this is the most volatile. This is the one that we as fundraisers have the least amount of control over. We certainly can do good work in getting people to include us in their state plans, but if we're following the letter of the law, we can't do anything to make those gifts come quicker. It tends to go up and down based on what happens with a few very large estates. So you can have one or two really significant estates move this number by percentage points on any given year. Up 5.5 billion compared to prior year, so up a little bit, but you can see there's no trend to this. There's no year over year trend. It's very unmanageable. It goes up and down based on what happens with a few individuals, with not a lot that we can do about it. I often tell people, if you ever are in a doctor's office and hooked up to a machine and you look over and what you see on the machine looks anything like this chart, you are in real trouble. Giving back corporations also increased. It was up to $18.55 billion in 2017, a $2.2 billion increase. Almost 20% of that increase is the result of natural disasters occurring in the United States. You'll remember that in 2017 we had some really significant natural disaster crises in various parts of the country, including some massive flooding in Texas and the Southeast, and some of the worst wildfires we've ever seen out on the West Coast. So a lot of the increase that we saw in corporate giving was in response to that, providing assistance and aid and in-kind materials to aid with those natural disasters that happened last year. So we're glad to see it increase. The question becomes, without natural disasters on that scale, is it a sustainable increase, or was it a one-time blip as a reaction to that? We don't know the answer to that, and we won't know until next year, but that really explains where a lot of that comes from. Also keep in mind that it's estimated that almost half of all corporate giving is in-kind gifts, and most of that is in the form of pharmaceuticals and computer software. So for most organizations, if you're not in the business of distributing pharmaceuticals either to people in need in this country or in other countries, and if you don't need a massive software implementation, your slice of the potential corporate contribution pie is much smaller than the total. And that really applies to most organizations. So we're happy to see growth, happy to see some sustained and sharp growth, as you can see on the chart, and hope it continues into the next year. As we take a look at grouping these into 5-year spans, it's sometimes, especially when you see the chart for a bequest, it's hard to make any sense out of that when it's up and down year over year. And what we found is that if we group these into larger blocks, and we choose 5-year blocks, you can begin to see the trends a little more clearly. So if you look at this chart, one of the things that you can clearly see is happening here is that the percentage of contributions coming from individuals is going down. You look back on the left side of the chart, you see 78 to 82, individual giving was 83% of total giving. We go all the way back to the right side and we can see that we're now at 71% of total giving. If you look at the very bottom piece of this, which is corporate giving, you can see that it's pretty much held steady since 1978 at 5% of all giving. And if you look at the next piece, which is bequest giving, which is unpredictable in year-over-year charting, but if you look at it here, you can see it's pretty much held steady around 8% every year going back to the 70s. What's changed is that the percentage of foundation giving has taken a larger share of the pie. And you can see that that's really where if you want to think about this as market share, that's where individual giving is losing some market share. But again, if we remember that about half of that is family foundations, which is very similar to individual giving. So if we take that 16% and we take 8 of that and add it back to individual giving, we're at 78% there, and 8% for foundation giving, and we're pretty much on where the average has been over time. So that's really where the shift is happening. Bequest giving and corporate giving fairly flat when you look at them over the last 30 years, but there's been some swapping between individual giving and foundation giving, but they're really very closely related. So that's where the money came from. When we come back after a short break, we're going to look at where the money went through the different subsectors of the nonprofit community.
I first became familiar with Alexander Haas roughly 10 years ago when I was living in the Atlanta area and I was running a consulting firm called Advancement Solutions, focusing primarily on the advancement services and operations arena. But it was at the same time that there were many changes going on in the area of tax law and reform, and so I became familiar with Alexander Haas and they became familiar with me, and over time we developed a relationship where if they, Alexander Haas, found that they had a client needing my kind of assistance, that they would contact me and I would be added to their program for a particular client. 5 years later or so, I went to work at NC State and was the campaign manager for a $1.6 billion campaign. And when I left and returned to full-time consulting, David King and Alexander Haas and I developed a stronger relationship. And roughly 2 years ago, I was asked if I would become a partner of the firm, and the rest is history.
All right, we're back. Special episode of Futures in Fundraising, taking a look at the just released Giving USA 2018 data. We've talked about where the money came from, corporations, foundations, individuals, bequests. Now we're going to take a look at where all that money went. Again, $410 billion given away last year. As you can see on the famous Giving USA pie chart, religion once again was the largest slice of the pie at 31%. Followed by education, human services, and gifts going into grant-making foundations. Then health, public society benefit, arts and culture, international affairs, environment and animals, and then gifts to individuals. As you look at this chart, 31% to religion, that's actually 1 percentage point lower than what the contribution level was last year. And we'll talk about religion a little bit more because it is one of the few slices of the pie that's declining in market share. If you look at education, that's actually down 1%, was 15% last year, down to 14%, but still the second largest slice of the pie. Human services held steady at 12% of the total. Gifts going into foundation is up 1% to 11 from 10 last year. Giving into health also up 1%, was 9% this year compared to 8% prior year. Public society benefit also down 7% last year. This year, 8% last year, so a slight decrease for public society benefit. And then as we look at the remainder of the chart, arts and culture, international affairs, environment and animals, and gifts to individuals all held steady with the same percentages as the prior year. So really the movement this year has been in the 5 largest slices of the pie, with a couple losing market share and a couple picking it up as we move along. take a closer look at giving to religion, you can see the chart here that shows the growth in giving to religion. 2.9% increase in 2017 over 2016. That equates to about $4.4 billion in increase. You can see it appears on this chart, and this chart shows that there's steady growth in giving to religion. But if you dig a little bit closer into the numbers on giving to religion, there's actually another story here, and there's something very different going on. So look at this next chart. This chart's the percentage of all giving that went to religion from 1985 to 2017. And what you can see here is that in 1985, giving to religious organizations was 53% of all giving, more than half of the total giving pie. What you see in 2017 is it's actually reached its lowest level in 30 years, over 30 years, at 31% of the total pie. And that trend line that you can see there shows what's really happening, that even though the prior slide showed growth in the dollars going into religion, in terms of the amount of the total being given to religion, it's been in a dramatic decline for the last 30 years and has reached its lowest point ever as a percentage of the total. This other slide shows you a little bit more about how giving to religion is not keeping up with the pace of overall giving. So the orange bar that you see here is the growth rate and the growth in total giving. And you can see here in the last, going back to just after the end of the recession, so 2009-10 up to current date, that we're on a pretty steep upward trend in growth. But look at those bottom two lines. The blue line is inflation-adjusted giving to religion, and the gray line is current dollar giving to religion. And they're just not moving at the same rate. They're almost flat. The growth, that inflation-adjusted growth is very close to flat. So we're really, even though the dollars are going up in giving to religion, and even though it is still the largest piece of the pie, it is not holding its market share. It is losing market share dramatically, and isn't growing at anything close to the same rate that we see the rest of the nonprofit sector growing. There are a lot of factors involved here. One is declining church attendance. It's fairly well documented in research and studies that millennials and Generation X are much less likely to affiliate and attend worship services than their predecessors were. And so that accounts for some of the decline. I believe that another element that accounts for the decline is that by and large, churches particular, but let's talk about religious congregations because it cuts across all the kinds of denominations and religious faiths. Religious congregations are the last part of the nonprofit sector to really professionalize the fundraising function. So think about most churches that you're aware of. Very few have a full-time person who comes in every day and their job is to help raise money to support the ministry. But if you look at every other kind of nonprofit you can think of, they all have a staff person or multiple staff person, or in some cases hundreds of staff people whose full-time job is to raise the money to fund that organization. So I think part of the problem that we see with this decline in giving to religion is around the fact that it's just not taken seriously still in congregations as a function that needs to be staffed and worked on every day. It is a necessary evil to some congregations, and I believe that lack of professionalization is part of why we see religion losing market share at a fairly rapid rate. Turn to giving it to education. 6.2% growth in 2017. That's a little over $3.4 billion in new money coming in. You can see on the chart that it is a pretty strong growth over the last 5 years for giving to religion. You can also see that giving to education took a very sharp dive during the recession. It was one of the most dramatically impacted areas during the recession, but has made a nice recovery, has reached its highest point of all time at $58.9 million. It will be interesting to see as we move forward. One of the aspects of the tax law that was passed at the end of 2017 was the removal of tax deductibility for contributions to college and university athletic programs if those contributions come with access to tickets to sporting events or other sporting event benefits. So those gifts will no longer be considered charitable contributions or tax deductible. that is a significant amount of money that goes into higher education in particular. It will be very interesting to see if the loss of those gifts to athletics programs being tax deductible causes this to go down. That could be several $1 billion that's currently being contributed to education organizations that either isn't contributed anymore because it's no longer deductible, or is still given to those organizations but is no longer a charitable contribution. So we could see this giving to education take a slight dip next year just based on the loss of those athletic gifts alone, unless there's steady growth in other areas. When we look at human services, you can see that human services has been a little bit on an up and down, but mostly up, a nice growth trajectory, up $3.2 billion last year. That's over 5% growth. Still a very strong element of the nonprofit sector, and still the third largest slice of the overall giving pie. Looking at gifts to foundations, again, very erratic, very hard to predict. A lot of the growth in giving to foundations is correlated with the stock market. People tend to contribute appreciated assets into their foundations as opposed to cash. And you can see here on the chart that there are lots of ups and downs. And if you go back and look, you'll find some of those are in fact correlated to what's going on in the markets. You know that we are in a very strong period for the stock markets at the moment, and you can see a very strong, almost straight up and down growth trajectory there for giving into foundations. The increase for 2017 was $5.2 billion. But an interesting thing about this, and this goes back to, remember we talked earlier about $4.5 billion of individual giving was from mega gifts. Well, $4.3 billion of what went into foundations was also from mega gifts. So those numbers are very close. So a lot of that growth in individual giving, turns out, was going into foundations, not directly into the nonprofit sector. The other interesting fact about this is, of that $4.3 billion in mega gifts that went into foundations, $3 billion of it came from two people. Mark Zuckerberg funding his foundation and Michael Dell adding more money to his foundation. That's the source of $3 billion of the 4.3 in growth into that sector. So it really, this is particularly impacted by mega gifts, and the mega gifts into foundations drove a lot of what we're seeing as growth in individual giving last year. Looking at giving to healthcare organizations, you can see also growing, again, also at a $38.2 billion as the highest amount ever. Grew by a little over $5 billion last year. That's a little over 7% growth. If you look at this chart, one of the things that people always ask about is this big spike that happened in, looks like about 1996 on the chart. What happened then? Why did so much money get poured into healthcare then? Well, it's a bit of an anomaly. What happened then was that Blue Cross Blue Shield, which was the largest nonprofit health insurance company in the country at the time, made the decision to turn themselves into a for-profit insurance company. And the government said, fine, you can do that, but you've been living tax-free for all these years, so you're going to have to take some of this money that you've earned tax-free and put it back into the nonprofit sector. So what happened is you saw a lot of foundations set up, healthcare related foundations set up as a result of the Blue Cross Blue Shield transition, and money from Blue Cross Blue Shield went in to fund those foundations. So it created this spike in giving that was related to a entity changing its corporate status, not really to philanthropy. And if you look at the chart and sort of draw a straight line from the 7.7 billion here in 82 to where we are now at 38 billion, you can see that it's a fairly steady linear growth pattern. If you pull out that one little anomaly that really had nothing to do with us as fundraisers, it really had to do with a particular business changing its business model. Turning to public society benefit. Public society benefit is organizations that aggregate money and then redistribute it to other organizations. So an example of an organization that would fall in here would be the United Way, the United Jewish Appeal, the Combined Federal Campaign, any kind of federated campaign like that that receives contributions from donors and then redistributes those out to other nonprofits. What's also in this number, and what is really driving the growth in this number, is the national donor-advised funds. So places like Schwab and Fidelity that are for-profit entities but that offer donor-advised funds to their customers. So money going into donor-advised funds is really what's driving the growth in the public society benefits subsector. I think we're all out there in the field seeing more and more donors setting up these donor-advised funds. And we know that a lot of money is going that direction, and that really is what's driving this. 7.8% growth for this subsector last year. That's $2.1 billion, but a lot of it into donor-advised funds. Looking at giving to arts, culture, and humanities organizations, again, if you look at the last 5-year period, you can see a very steep period of growth. And if you pull back and look at the period right around the Great Recession, 2008-9, you can see that this subsector took a really dramatic hit. If you look further to the left on the chart, look around 1999, 2000, you can see another big hit. And if you look back into the late 1980s, you see it again. The arts subsector gets hit the hardest whenever we hit a financial crisis in this country. It's the area that people pull back on, or perhaps they redirect their money to human services or another area where they feel there's greater need at that particular moment in time. It also happens to recover very quickly when the recession ends, and you can see that here on this chart. In fact, last year the growth rate was 8.7% growth over the prior year, and that's $1.3 billion more dollars going into the arts and culture section than the prior year. It is one of the fastest growing subsectors if you look at the 10 years since the recession ended. Arts and culture giving has really recovered at a strong rate. When we look at giving to international affairs, this is the only subsector that saw a decline last year. Every other subsector saw growth, but international affairs giving saw a decrease of 4.4%, which is a little over $1 billion. You can see the hook there on the chart that's demonstrating that. Why did this happen? Well, this subsector is heavily influenced by typically natural disasters that happen at other places in the world, so outside of the U.S. So think about Japanese tsunami, think about earthquake, things like that happen around the world where people in the United States want to help and send aid. It doesn't tend to be influenced as much by man-made humanitarian crises. So think about things like the war in Syria and the refugee crisis that's created. That hasn't driven a lot of giving to international affairs because organizations can't get in there to do anything. It's a very dangerous place to be, and aid just can't get there, so you don't see organizations raising a lot of aid for that. But this is heavily driven by national disasters, and we really, fingers crossed, haven't had any of those in a couple of years. So this starts to take a decline. And remember that we did see a lot of, that I mentioned corporate giving was up significantly because of domestic natural disasters that we had last year. So likely that some of the money that may have gone to international affairs giving, if there had been an international natural disaster, was diverted and was given to that support the people who were affected by natural disasters here in the United States last year. So this is the only subsector to decline. Really this year, 4.4% decline, which is significant. But in some ways, this is good news because it means there wasn't a giant international tragedy last year that needed to be funded. When we look at giving to environment and animals, you see that also is on a steady growth, up 7.2%, and the 7 to 8% growth, that's pretty consistent across most of these subsectors. We really saw that kind of growth last year, along with the overall growth. $780 million more dollars into environment and animal giving. You can see again with this one, this is also one of those that is highly sensitive to the economy. When you have economic things happen, downturns, look again at 2000 on this chart, at 2008 on this chart, you see where giving to the environment and animals takes a dip with things that happen in the economy. But you can also see that we're in a really strong 5-year growth period. Last year when the results came out, we talked some about the impact of rage giving. or rage philanthropy, I think is the term, which to me seems like an oxymoron. The definition of philanthropy is the love of mankind, but you have rage in there. It's hard to reconcile those, but reactionary giving in response to the 2016 elections. And we saw a lot of money going to environmental organizations and other types of organizations that people felt were going to be under fire with the changes in at the federal government level. So that came in and caused a spike last year, but that growth rate has continued this year. Perhaps the threat is continued, and that's impacting it. But good continued growth for giving into the environment and animal welfare areas. Much like we look at the sources of gifts in 5-year spans to sort of flatten out the bumps and get a different, maybe clearer picture of what's going on, we also can do that with where the money goes. So take a look at this chart, and it really makes evident what I talked about was happening in giving to religion. You can look back and see in the 5-year period of 1983 to 87, 58% of all giving went to religious organizations. You look at the 5-year period 2013 to 2017, and that's down to 32%. So you can see that dramatic growth as we group these, or shrinkage as we put these things together. The other thing that you can see from this chart is it's not that all giving just suddenly switched to one area. It's not like giving to religion deploded while giving to education exploded and they traded market share. If you can look at it, it's sort of death by 1,000 paper cuts for giving to religion. You've got all of these subsectors picking up a couple, 3, 4 points here and there, all of them growing and just eating into the market share that religion once had. So it's really not that some one subsector has become significantly more important to us and supplanted giving to religion. It's that every one of them is just taking a little bite and dragging down that giving to religion. You can see this even more clearly if you pie chart it. This is the growth rate in all of the subsectors for the last 5 years, and you won't find this in Giving USA, and you won't find it on the Giving USA website. This is something that we pulled together at Alexander Haas as we began to analyze these numbers and try to dig a little deeper. So this is your Futures in Fundraising exclusive nugget here, but you can take a look at the growth over the 5-year period. You can see that even though foundation it was on a pretty steep curve and we saw a lot of growth there, when we look at these in 5-year periods, it actually has grown the slowest over the last 5 years at just over 9%, public society benefit 10%, religion 12%, and the fastest growing area, and I mentioned this before about the recovery, arts, 34.7% growth over the last 5 years, environment and animals, 33%. International affairs, 32% over the last 5 years. So even though international affairs was down 4% this year, when you look at the 5-year span, it's still in a very strong growth rate over the last 5 years. The other thing that we can do with this is take an even longer perspective on it and take a look at how that compares on a 10-year growth span. So on this chart, you'll see the same blue bars that you saw before is the 5-year growth rate for all of the subsectors. When you look at the orange bars, that's the 10-year growth rate. So look at that public society benefit growth rate over the last 10 years, almost 50% growth for public society benefit. And really a great deal of that is due to the rise of donor advised funds, and specifically the large institutional money managers establishing donor advised funds and marketing them to their clients. That has really driven a lot of that growth. You can also see very strong growth, again, close to 50% growth in giving into education. I think we all know that education has been defunded at the government levels for the last 10 years and increasingly need contributions just to continue to deliver quality educational programming. It's no longer where charitable gifts are really to add icing to the cake or the cherry on top. Now a lot of giving into education is to make the cake. So you see a lot of growth there in response to the need. You see real growth in giving to health and health care organizations. Strong growth again in the arts, environment, and animals. And this really does even further emphasize what's happened with giving to religion. You can look, it is absolutely the smallest growth rate by far over the last 10-year period, 16% growth. So yes, it's growing at a 16% rate, but when you've got 4 other subsectors growing in excess of 40% rate, more than 3 times the growth rate, you can see how religion is losing its market share when you've got these other growth rates happening. You'll also notice on this chart that giving to human services appears to have grown, has grown more slowly than all of the other subsectors except giving to religion. So on the 10-year period, we're at 26.7, 20.1 over the 5-year period. But a caveat to that, if you go back and look at the giving to human services slide by itself, it's the one subsector that you will see that did not decline coming out of the Great Recession. So 2009 and 10, remember we saw a big dip in giving to education on their slide. We saw a big dip to giving in the arts in 2009-10. We saw a big dip in giving into the environment. But if you go look at the human services slide, you'll see that it didn't dip. So while the growth rate is slower in that subsector, it didn't have to make up a big loss. So in terms of dollar growth, even though the growth rate is slower, it started at a better level. It maintained its level. So you don't have to feel bad for your friends working in human services fundraising because they actually didn't experience the dip, so they didn't have to make it up to see increased growth. I hope you've learned something from this presentation of this information. I'll hope you will go to givingusa.com. You can download a lot of the slides we showed you today for free. You can get the overview and the content. You can also buy the book. We have last year's version right up here. You can get this year's version of the book, or you can download just the chapter that is specific to the subsector you work in. We hope you enjoyed this presentation. We hope you learned something from it, and we hope you'll join us next time on Futures in Fundraising.